So after 9 years, Stranger Things has finally come to an end, so that means it's time for me to give you all my review of the final season of the show. Yo, what is up, movie fans? My name is Andrew, aka Noezone, and I cannot believe that I'm saying that after all this time, we are finally at the end of this show. Even though I started watching the show later than most people, it still feels like it's just been a part of pop culture for most of my life. Just constantly being in conversation, even when it's not coming out. So it really does feel like the end of an era when it comes to TV, and I'm really curious to see what next show fills its place. But we'll just have to see with due time. But without any further ado, let's get into this review. Starting out with my positives, and I think the first thing I want to talk about is the actual ending of this season, because while I did not like the first half of the finale very much, if you want to check out my entire finale review, I have a video up for that. But in that video, I was talking about just how much I did not like that first half. But the second half with all the epilogue stuff that actually ended off the show was actually really good. I feel like every character arc ended in the way it was supposed to. It did a good job of swelling up the emotions, especially in the very last scene of the show, with them playing D&D instead of going to that party, and Mike giving that speech about being the storyteller and giving that like alternate ending for Elle, even though some people believe that's her actual ending. But we all know Mike's just coping, to be honest. I also like that final scene because it just gives a book end to the characters we've been following for this long, and kind of showing the cycle of when the new generation comes in with like Holly and Derek. Another positive that I want to go over is that some of the highs this season are the highest of the entire show. Like in episode 4, for example, with Will becoming the sorcerer, because I remember seeing that moment for the first time and just being so excited for the rest of the season. Now, to be fair, the rest of the season did disappoint me, but in that moment at the end of volume 1, that was like some of the highest hype I've had for the show. And I think I saw a tweet that describes this feeling that I have perfectly, where someone said that this season was TASM 2 coded, and I feel like that really describes it to a T, because The Amazing Spider-Man 2 has some of the highest highs that I've ever seen in a Spider-Man movie, but it also has some of the lowest lows, and that is honestly how Stranger Things Season 5 feels to me. I also think Stranger Things Season 5 did a really good job at the beginning of the season of getting all the characters back together and showing what they had accomplished in the time jump, because they just seem so much more put together and calculated. You had Mike being a leader again like he was in season 1 and 2. You had the original party going and doing stuff together, which was really cool. It almost felt like it was setting a new status quo for the show while retreading old ones. And I mean the retreading thing in the best way possible, because it felt like this was the first time since season 3 where the kids felt like a cohesive unit again. So that was nice to see at the beginning of the season. I also think there are a few acting performances worth shouting out. And the first one's got to be Sadie Sink as Max, because just like in season 4, she just kept proving why she's so much better of an actor than all of the other kids in the show, even though they're not really kids anymore, but you know what I mean. I think the two scenes that showcase her acting the best are when she came back from her coma, and the scene where she said, "I believe," after Mike's speech about 11, because hers hit the absolute hardest because she can act so much better than all the other kids around her. But speaking of the scene where she comes back from the coma, I also want to shout out McLaughlin, because he was even better in the scene where she came back from the coma, and it reminded me of his performance at the end of season 4 where he was yelling for Erica, because it just had this like gut-wrenching feel to it that I think Caleb needs to bring into other projects that he's going to be doing in the future. Another thing that I liked about season 5, and this was specifically because it was an upgrade over season 4, and that's got to be the CGI, because there were a ton of times in season 4, especially when Vecna was killing people, where the CGI was just looking rough. And I really feel like they set out to fix that in season 5, because I really can't remember a spot where I thought the CGI was bad this season. And also the Thessal Hydra that they fight in the finale just looks flawless in my opinion. And I feel like that's also due to the practical effects being good as well, to have that base to build that CGI onto. Because if you look at the behind the scenes at some of the sets that they were working on, a lot of the stuff was practical, which as a horror movie fan, I'm always going to praise in a project. And just like with every other season of Stranger Things, the score was also a highlight. I mean, I feel like it's almost redundant at this point. Like the score for every season just has that 80s synth vibe to it that just puts a smile on your face. At least it does for me. And this season's no different. The editing, while not as snappy as it was in previous seasons, was still really good in this final season. There are definitely some characters that I'm positive on in this season. And the first one I'm going to bring up is Mike. And that's because, like I was mentioning earlier, Mike is acting like season 1 and 2 Mike again. And that just made his character so much better than the way he acted in season 3 and 4. 4, because he just became like a whiny, smug brat in season 3, and he just kept that up in season 4. But in this season, it's almost like they just did a whole reset on his character and put him back to basics, which I really appreciated, and it just made his character rise up the rankings for me. I think Karen was absolutely badass in this season, and she just has so many cheer-worthy moments, especially when she takes on a Demogorgon with a wine bottle, and then later in the season takes on some Demodogs in the hospital while injured. She just really proved that she could hold her own with the rest of the cast, and I'm glad that they gave her those moments. Delightful Derek was also a positive character for me because he was just so funny, and him telling basically every character to suck his fat one just always got a laugh out of me, especially when he did it to Vecna in the finale. That was probably the most satisfying one. But I think the unanswered question that I really want to know is, where are his parents and his sister at? Are they still in that barn tied up? And even though Hopper was just acting like he does in every other season, I still want to put him in my positive section because he did have a couple of moments that were still heartwarming as always, especially in the finale when he's talking to Eleven about not sacrificing herself. Just some of those moments were hitting hard for me. One of the few times this season that were really getting the emotions up. And that's because David Harbour was born to play this character because of just the pure dad energy he gives off. But the last characters that I was positive on this season have got to be Steve and Dustin. And if you watch my Volume 1 review, Dustin was actually in my mixed section, but by the end of the season, I loved the arcs that they did with Steve and Dustin. They fought for a while, and Steve had to say some really hurtful but truthful things to Dustin, but they made up by the end, and I loved all their stuff in the epilogue, that they still hang out even though Dustin's in college, and that Steve is a baseball coach now. It just feels very fitting for their characters, and I love that their friendship is kind of just everlasting even through the finale. Another positive I have with season 5 has got to be the way Vecna was taken out. Now, while I do think it was too easy, which I'll talk about later, I'd want to say that I love the fact that Joyce is the one that gets to chop his fucking head off. It was just such a satisfying way to do that, and after Joyce has really done nothing this season, it was just nice having her to get that moment, and because this started off as a Winona Ryder comeback show, it just felt very poetic for her to be the one to give Vecna that final blow at the axe. And moving on to my mixed section of the review, and the first thing, first and foremost, has got to be the lack of character deaths in this season. And I was never one of these people that wanted this show to turn into Game of Thrones and just be an absolute bloodbath and don't get attached to your favorite character type of thing. But for a final season of the show, it just felt like there were zero stakes because they would not take out any of the characters. And the characters that they did take out, I still had problems with those deaths. Because you took out 11, and I'm just not a fan of the way she went out. It just felt like it undercut her whole character, where she started in the show. Even Hopper gave a speech about this earlier in the finale, when he was talking about how much she had been abused and tortured and experimented on. And then they just have her go out in the way she did instead of in a badass way in battle against the Thessal Hydra. I just felt like that would have been way more satisfying than what we got. And then we had Kali, which who even cares about that character death? And it also felt pointless to bring her back in the first place because you just brought her back just to kill her. And she barely did anything for the plot besides putting the idea in Elle's brain to sacrifice herself. So it makes me dislike her character even more than I did before they brought her back in season 5. I just felt like there were more opportunities to kill more likable characters, and with characters that would have a bigger impact on fans if they went out. I mean, you didn't have to kill 5 or 6 people, but you could have taken out like Jonathan or something. Especially with him and Nancy breaking up, I feel like that was the perfect opportunity to take one of them out. And it just would have elevated the stakes of the season way more if they did that. But the only reason this is my mixed section and not my negative section is because I did like all of the endings for the characters in the epilogue, so it kind of softened the blow a little bit of not killing a bunch of characters. And speaking of Jonathan and Nancy, we have got to talk about that breakup scene. And while I was never really confused on whether they broke up or not, even though a lot of fans were the next day, I still think it has some of the most convoluted dialogue I've ever seen in a breakup scene. But while the journey to get to the breakup was very rocky, I still like the fact that those characters did break up. And it felt good for both of the characters to do that, because when they started listing out all the reasons of how they're different, you start to realize that this is not the in-game relationship that we thought it was. And also, I was much more on the team that they should have Max and Lucas be that in-game couple for the show, and that's what they ended up going with, so I was satisfied. But the next thing has got to be Noah Schnapp's acting as Will, because there are some scenes where I really feel like he's improved as an actor, and he was selling me on a lot of the emotions they were trying to make me feel. But then there were other instances, like his come out scene, where he has to carry the entire scene with his acting ability, and he just cannot do it. Like, it was almost cringe inducing because he just could not convey the emotions correctly that they wanted me to feel. But I will give him some credit and say that the writing for that scene wasn't all there either. But I do think that his acting was probably the biggest offender of why that scene didn't work. And then the next day after Volume 2 dropped, they revealed of how long it took them to actually shoot that specific scene. And I think it was like 12 hours with like tons of reshoots. And after seeing the performance that Noah Schnapp gave, I can kind of see why. Another thing that I felt mixed on in this season was the fact that there were some pretty big characters that were just getting a backseat. And I touched on this a little bit earlier when I was talking about Joyce's big moment in the finale. But Joyce just absolutely had nothing to do in this final season, and that's so disappointing for me to say, because Stranger Things started off as a Winona Ryder show, and her dynamic with David Harbour and her trying to find her son throughout all of season 1 is what made this show special, in my opinion. Like, there are so many moments in season 1 where she's giving the most manic performance possible of like trying to find her boy, and it just brings tears to your eyes. So to not have her really doing much in this final season just makes zero sense in my opinion. Also, even though Murray is more of a side character, I also feel like they turned him into like an Amazon driver in this last season. He barely had anything to do, and he gets that one big moment in the finale where he like throws the grenades down and then Kali dies. But that's really it. And besides a few lines here and there where he gets like a laugh out of me, I basically forgot he was in the season. And another thing that I want to touch on, and it has to do with the actual stakes of this season again, and it's specifically the moment where Nancy shoots like the wall of the wormhole and like Dustin freaks out that everybody's gonna die, but then nothing happens. It felt like they made such a big deal about Nancy doing that and like almost pulling like a Star-Lord Infinity War moment just for it to not amount to anything. And also the discovery that the Upside Down is really a wormhole didn't really amount to much either, besides the fact that it's the bridge to the abyss. There were just so many moments where they would tell me the stakes of the situation, but they weren't showing me with anything that the characters were facing. If you notice so far, a lot of my issues started in Volume 2. But the last thing that I have in my mixed section has got to be the emotional value of this season, because it's pretty all over the place and not as consistent as it was for me in previous seasons. Because there are moments like the epilogue, and especially the last scene of the epilogue, where like I'm almost getting there to tear up, or like some of the dialogue that Hopper has with Elle towards the end of the season, or the conflict between Steve and Dustin and how that resolved, and when Max comes out of her coma. But then there are moments where they're trying to make me cry and it's just falling flat on its face. So for a show that normally is pretty good about getting me emotional by the end, especially in the season finales, this season just mostly didn't do it for me, except some standout moments, which I named. All right, now moving on to my negatives with season 5 of Stranger Things. And I think my first clear negative has got to be the rewatchability, because I just do not see myself rewatching this season anytime in the future, or at least anytime soon, unless I do a rewatch later down the line in a few years. It's just not going to hold that rewatch value that season 1, season 3, or season 4 have for me. And I honestly think with the final season being as underwhelming as it's been, I think it's going to hurt my rewatchability of the whole show. Because I'm a big fan of when stuff has good endings or good final seasons. So when I sit down to watch a show, I want to get to that ending again. Like whenever I rewatch Breaking Bad, I'm so excited to get to season 5 again. But with this show, I'm constantly going to be thinking like, maybe I'll stop at season 4. And that might be what I do in the future, to be honest. Another negative that I had with season 5 has got to be the pacing, because this is by far the most poorly paced season of Stranger Things. And maybe that's because I watched it split up into the volumes, but I'm going to still give that as a fault because I think the release schedule was absolutely awful for this season, with them releasing a 4-episode batch, a 3-episode batch, and the finale all on holidays too. I feel like I totally have to knock that against this season because that is ridiculous. But even with it being in batches, Volume 2 just killed all the momentum that Volume 1 built up, because Volume 1 had a gradual build up. You had like episode 1 and 2, they were pretty good episodes, but they were slower. Episode 3 started getting crazy, and episode 4 had like huge moments. So it's almost like we just stopped all that momentum. Is like, yeah, you know that stuff you liked about Volume 1 and that gradual buildup? Yeah, we're just going to completely halt that. That's what Volume 2 felt like for me, and especially in episodes 6 and 7, it just killed all the momentum going into the finale for me. So I already going into the finale was already watching at an arm's length because the season had just killed so much momentum. So yeah, the pacing of this season is easily one of my negatives because I haven't had this issue with any other season of Stranger Things besides season 2, and that's only with one episode, and then the finale wins me back in. And my last negative that I have with the season is with how easy it was to beat Vecna in the finale, or Vecna in the Mind Flayer, I should say. Because while I did appreciate in the finale that they didn't give Vecna this like Darth Vader redemption arc type of thing, and he honestly just had more of a Venom moment where he fused with the Mind Flayer, I just think the way that they beat Vecna just encapsulates all of my problems with this season to a T. With just the thrown together plot just to get to the good epilogue stuff kind of just felt cheap. Because watching this season and having the full picture now, I think the Duffer brothers needed some notes on the whole middle portion of this season. Because season 5 has a great beginning and a great end, but everything in the middle from like episode 6 up until the first half of the finale just really needed some work. And with how easy it was to win against that conflict just shows how poor the writing was. And not only does it highlight the poor writing of this season, but it also highlights the stakes, and it also highlights which characters aren't getting much to do. That's what I mean by the finale's first half just really highlighted all of my issues. The one thing that I will say about that fight with the Thessal Hydra is that Eleven has like never been more badass than she was in that fight. And that was very cool to see for one last hoorah for the character, but she should have died there at the peak of her character arc right there. Not in some half-ass thrown together way just so you could throw in Purple Rain in your finale. But overall, Stranger Things season 5 has some of the highest highs that Stranger Things has to offer, but it also has some of the lowest lows of the entire show. This might be a hot take, but I think they should have spent a little bit more time writing this season, because even though we had to wait 3 years for them to release this after season 4, it still felt rushed, which is just kind of insane to say. But with that being said, I did really love the way the season started in volume 1, and I love the last 40 minutes of epilogue and wrapping up everyone's character arcs. So I feel like all of that leads me to this being my scorecard for Stranger Things season 5. But y'all let me know down in the comments below what y'all thought of Stranger Things season 5. Did it underwhelm you? Did it surprise you? Did it just live up to your expectations? I want to hear all about it. Make sure you leave a like on the video if you enjoyed my review of the season. Subscribe to the channel and turn notifications for more movie and TV show content just like this. Share the video with a friend if you think they would enjoy it as well. And as always, guys, it's been Noezone. Peace.